Welcome to the 9th episode of Patio Pondering, the podcast. Today's guest is Mr. Todd Thurman, hailing from Winnery, Texas. Todd has a 25-year career in the pork industry, where he has served pig farms both domestically and internationally. Grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and listen to our conversation as we cover both controversial and trivial topics in the domestic swine industry, and cover Todd's journey from the dusty plains of the Texas Panhandle to pig farms in China, the United States, and Russia. Because of the depth of our discussion, this is part one of 3 podcast episodes to cover our entire conversation. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Patio Pondering. Today we have a auspicious guest, Mr. Todd Thurman, who is currently the owner of Swine Insights, is an industry consultant for the swine industry that works both in the United States and internationally. He is also the co-host of the Business of Ag Success Group with Damian Mason, and that's where Todd and I connected. It's interesting, Todd, you and I have kind of the similar timeline, and starting in the swine industry for jobs after graduation. I started in 98, you started in 99. So we've seen a lot of changes in our, not only our lifetime, but our career in the swine industry. And today I'd like to dive in and talk about your experiences and how that swine industry's changed and how we might go forward into the 2025 and beyond. So before we get started, could you kind of give us a brief overview of your career and what you do at Swine Insights?
Yeah, so maybe I'll go back a little bit further. I grew up, I would say, ag adjacent. My family was in agriculture a few generations before. My great-grandpa was a farmer and rancher in Oklahoma and Texas, and he sold out in the 70s because nobody was really interested in taking over there. So he sold out and retired in the 70s. He lived to see my daughter, so we've got 5-generation pictures there. Okay. So I definitely got to know him, and I think some of my interest in agriculture definitely came from stories that he told about his background. And so I guess my dad was a environmental chemist. He got a degree in environmental science back when very few people even offered that.
Oh boy.
And so he worked for the power company, but one of his responsibilities early in his career was managing the wastewater that came off of the cooling towers of the power plants. And in doing so, he worked with a local farmer and rancher there whose land the ponds were on. And so he had a really good relationship with him, and ended up being, I guess, my first real introduction to agriculture was working in his cow-calf operation in the summers. So that was probably my first formal job, I guess. And so really kind of spurred some interest in agriculture in me. And when I gave up my dream to be a fighter pilot, when I found out that my eyes were not good enough, I grew up in the original Top Gun era. So
yes, the real Maverick.
Yeah. I found out that not only was my eyes not good enough to be Maverick, they weren't good enough to be Goose either. So probably not even good enough to be the guy that was on the deck of the aircraft carrier. So I started looking around and trying to see what I really wanted to do with my life. And that's where I started getting interested in agriculture, and was probably one of the few people that kind of decide what you're going to want to do pretty early on in life and stick to it. So had a pretty good plans from the beginning.
Just a wee bit, Todd, was your interest in ag because your grandfather, or was there something in school that sparked you that, hey, I want to go into ag and ultimately work with pigs?
Yeah, I think just being around that cow-calf operation that my dad was that worked with, really good family, good people, interesting. It was just always appealing to me. I like hunting and fishing. I like being outside, and so just the idea of being, doing something, physical with my hands, I think was something that was really appealing to me. But I was also interested in getting in an education. So it seemed like an idea for me to be kind of involved in science, but also not get stuck in a lab somewhere, and just do science kind of stuff, but be out in the field. And that really, really, that idea appealed to me, I think, more than anything. And then you tie that back into, some of the stories my grandpa told me and some of the stories my dad told me about spending his summers on the ranch in Oklahoma. And I think that was just always appealing to me. So I always kind of had an interest in agriculture. My high school actually didn't have an ag program. And so I was in FFA, but I was only in FFA for 1 year because I had to go drive to another high school to do FFA. So I did get 1 year in my senior year. I had enough flexibility in my schedule to be able to fit that
Very
in.
good.
But so I was kind of behind the ball there in terms of not having access to some of those resources when I was younger. So,
Well, that's another thing that you and I share. I was not part of FFA. I actually lived on a cul-de-sac in town and chose to stay in the suburban high school, then transfer to the rural school. So it's interesting how there's a lot of commonality in our industry.
Yep, for sure.
So after you decided to go into ag, you spent some time at Cargill, Genesis, and now your own company. Can you kind of walk through your career, and then we can dovetail that into how that matches the change and consolidation and investment in the swine industry?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the Texas Panhandle, and so I was always sort of interested in the beef industry and the cattle industry, and I always just assumed kind of that's where I would land. But fate kept redirecting me back to swine for some reason. I went to junior college and I judged in junior college, and got some exposure there to that world and to the show world, and kind of found myself kind of attracted to the pigs in that respect. And then I got married between when I moved from junior college to Texas Tech. I got married that summer in between, and intended to keep judging, but then decided since I was married, maybe I ought to actually get a job that paid something. And so I ended up working at the research farm, but there wasn't much going on the cattle side, but there was a bunch of stuff going on in swine at the time. And so I ended up working at the research farm on the swine side.
And this was Texas Tech?
Yeah, at Texas Tech. I worked with
Did you
Dr.
work with
McGlone.
Dr. McGlone? Okay.
Yeah. So that was a great experience. He was a good mentor there on the swine side, but I really still expected to end up, back in the cattle industry. But when I graduated, I got an opportunity to go work for Cargill, and they didn't have anything I was really interested in. Again, I wanted to be in the field, and they kind of offered me more of an admin job on the cattle side, and I just really wasn't interested in that. I told them, I want to be out in the field doing things, working with animals, and so they referred me to the Cargill Pork, which was the pork production system that Cargill owned at the time, now part of the JBS system. And I went out there and interviewed for that job, and I guess the rest is history. I graduated from Texas Tech on Saturday, drove to Arkansas on Sunday, and started working for Cargill on Monday morning. So ended up being there for 15 years. The first half of that was with Cargill Pork, working in live production. Did a little bit of everything while I was there, but most of that was working in commercial sow production. And then when I left Cargill Pork and switched over to Cargill Animal Nutrition, I still stayed pretty focused on the production stuff. I was really working with the nutrition team to kind of strengthen their business understanding, their productivity understanding, and doing a lot of, I guess, business and productivity consulting with some of the animal nutrition's big clients. And then that also led me to an opportunity to do an international assignment. And my family and I moved to Russia for 2 years, and we started up a 25,000 sow fair to finish system there for a Cargill client. And that was obviously a formative opportunity. Never imagined growing up in the Texas Panhandle. We went to Mexico, but that hardly even counts as an international trip when you grow up in Texas.
Oh, yes, that's right.
But other than that, I'd never been out of the country, and ended up packing up, moving to Russia, and that really broadened my horizons and sparked an interest in international business too. So, when I came back from Russia, I guess they figured if I would move to Russia, I'd probably go just about anywhere. And I started, getting all the international assignments, or at least the ones that weren't all that attractive. You know, if you needed somebody to go to Jamaica in February, then I probably wasn't going. But if you needed to go to Russia in February, I was probably the guy. So.
Hey, send Todd. He likes it.
Yeah, he'll do it. But yeah, it was just, spent a lot of time in Asia, spent a lot of time in Latin America. I got to see the industry from a lot of different perspectives, and that really, couldn't have seen that coming, but, that would definitely ended up shaping the rest of my career. I left Cargill after 15 years, which is, unusual. Normally you stick it out that long, you're a lifer.
Yes.
But really wanted to do something different, and kind of felt like the corporate world was constraining me a little bit. And to be honest, got frustrated with having all the resources in the world and it being difficult to actually get anything done, you know?
Okay.
And so I kind of had a plan of starting my own consulting business, but I felt like I had some technical gaps that I needed to resolve. And one of those was around genetics. I was familiar with genetics as a consumer of genetics, but I didn't really understand the genetics business. And so I took an opportunity to take a job with Genesis Genetics out of Canada, managed, kind of did technical sales, I guess would be the best description of it. And that was managing key accounts in North America, managing key accounts in China, and then doing some business development stuff for them in Southeast Asia, mostly in the Philippines.
Okay.
And that I was there for 3 years. That gave me a really good opportunity to kind of understand the genetic sides of the business, and I think kind of fill in some necessary gaps in my technical skills that I would need to really do a good job as a swine management consultant. And so about 7.5 years ago, I took the leap and started the company, and we're really anything to do with live production or the business of swine production is kind of in our wheelhouse. We've got 5 of us that are got the core team of consultants, and then we have kind of an extended network that we draw in when we need to. 80% of our business is international. Probably 80% of that is Asia, and a big chunk of that is China. So we have a lot of exposure to China, which is good and bad, and we've definitely gotten plenty of both of that. But it really is it's an interesting opportunity to be able to kind of stay plugged in here in North America. I've got several clients here that we still work with here in North America, but really get to see the industry from a lot of different perspectives. So it's definitely keeps you on your toes.
Well, that's a wide array of experiences. I'm sure when you grew up in the Panhandle where it's mama cows, twigs, and tumbleweeds, you didn't expect to go to Russia, let alone start your own company.
No, really. Yeah, didn't have any, didn't intend to be in the pig industry, didn't intend to do anything international. Yeah, I've sort of joked, and not really joking, I guess, but I've told many people that, I really kind of built my career, doing things nobody else wanted to do and places nobody else wanted to go. And you know, that I started saying that sort of as a joke, but it's really kind of profound and really does, kind of explain my career in a lot of different ways. I mean, if you go back to even my early part of my career with Cargill Pork, I got a promotion that I think I was the youngest person ever to get that promotion. But it wasn't because I was, so good, I think necessarily. It's just the assignment was kind of a turd that nobody else really wanted to take on. And I guess I saw it as just a pure opportunity. I thought, well, I'm young. Everybody's expecting me to fail anyway. And so none of the more senior people really wanted that job because they felt like it was just kind of they were getting set up to fail or whatever. Okay. And I thought, well, what do I have to lose, right? If everybody expects me to fail, then I either fail and everybody expected it, or I succeed and nobody expected it. So, took took a different approach to that, I think, and ended up having some success there and really set up the rest of my career. So it's really fitting that my career kind of trajectory took off when I took a job that nobody wanted and an assignment that nobody wanted. And it kind of became my MO, I guess, for the rest of my career.
Well, I think there's a lesson there that we could use and go back to what we talk about in the Business of Ag Success group with Damian. I mean, a lot of times we just hammer home, you've got to be as good as or better than somebody else. And as we work in a commodity world, that's just a downward spiral to commonality. You chose to do something different, and look where it took you. I mean, I think we can think about that as we start a discussion about consolidation. And sometimes for us to succeed in our business, we need to do what somebody else does. And I joke, being Gen X, that you think about that Life commercial, hey, give it to Mikey, he likes it, so give it to Todd, he'll do that crazy assignment.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it really is. I mean, it's a good formula for being able to, explore different opportunities and kind of broaden your horizons. I mean, it seems like every turn I've stumbled onto something that ended up kind of defining the rest of my career, but it's really just about being open-minded. And I think understanding what your strengths are, where you're being self-aware enough to understand your strengths and sometimes more importantly, your weaknesses. And just being willing to take a stab at it and being willing to take a risk of, failing. If you take that easy path, then, the path to greatness, I don't think is ever really, smoothly paved, right? So,
no,
I would say I go out and actually seek out these opportunities that nobody else wants to tackle. And it's funny, I get a lot of people that come, a lot of students, and they'll ask me, I want to get into international business. And, how do you do that? And I thought, well, that I got into it because nobody else wanted to do it. Right. And so a lot of people think this is, that's really interesting. I'd like to be able to travel and stuff like that. And I'm like, yeah, it's not quite as glamorous as what you're imagining, probably. And I think about that all the time. I have these conversations. I can't believe you get to do all this crazy travel and go to these crazy places, and then I'll be spending the night in a farm in northern China in the wintertime, and I'm sleeping on a plywood bed and with a little space heater trying to keep me warm. Yeah, and I'm thinking, I wish these people could see me in this scenario.
Yeah, here's the glamour of international travel: a plywood bed in China.
It's crazy. The other day, I was in China on my most recent trip, and we ended up having to take one of the old trains, old, they call them the green trains. They're the old style trains, and so we're in this overcrowded train going back to Shanghai, trying to get snowing, trying to get back to the airport so that we can fly back to Shanghai. And so I'm in this overcrowded old train going 40 miles an hour and drinking warm beer out of a paper cup. And then that night I checked into the Ritz-Carlton in Shanghai. So
that is funny.
It's just, you have to look at, if you can't look at that and see the humor in that, then we're probably not going to get along.
Well, I traveled in Vietnam for one of my jobs for a month, and you and I have the same problem. We're over 6 foot. We got broad shoulders. We got long legs. And the people that we were with aren't. And I'm sure that 40-mile-an-hour train trip couldn't get over fast enough being a big American guy.
Yeah, we were in the dining car, and I was kind of crammed in there. But yeah, this even the Chinese guys that were with us were like, man, I hadn't been on one of these trains in a long time. It's almost like traveling back in time. Train. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Blowing some of those myths and impressions that people have. I was thinking as you were talking about taking jobs that nobody else would, when you were sitting in those board meetings or meetings with your team when you worked with Cargill or even with Genesis, would you consider yourself a contrarian where you were sitting there thinking, man, there's a different way to do this, or I disagree with what everybody else says?
Yeah, I was always, I think, opinionated. A lot of times, even now, I'm, people will I'll speak at a conference. It just happened just a few weeks ago. I spoke at a conference and afterwards, I thought it was I didn't think I really said anything controversial or whatever. It didn't seem controversial to me. And then I got these messages. these direct messages from people like, I saw you speak at the event, and it's really good to see somebody, talking about these controversial topics and not being afraid of, ruffling feathers and stuff like that. And I didn't even know what they were talking about, to be honest with you. I was like, well, I didn't even know it was controversial, So, I think it's just kind of in my nature, that I tend to be a little contrarian. I tend to see things differently. I have a natural perspective that I eventually learned was not, kind of normal, and figured out a way to kind of use that to my advantage, I think. And so, I think that's definitely something that's been a theme in my career, is that, I can see things a little bit, from a little bit different perspective. And I'm certainly willing to voice my opinion and hash that out. And I think people eventually see value in that, but you have to be really careful with that because, you have to develop those relationships that allow you to be direct like that. Because if you do that without having that, fundamental, trust that is built, in developing a relationship, then you can create problems for yourself. So, definitely been there, learn those lessons, all those lessons the hardest way possible. But,
and I think that when you brought up talking about students, I think when we go back to my education at Purdue and they're talking about their senior and sophomore seminars, they were like, hey, choose a company to do this and draw your plan out. And sometimes your plan has to fit you and you don't fit other people's plans. So I think you're a great illustration of be yourself and take advantage of opportunities when they come across.
I think it's one of the big advantages of the ag world is there's a lot of different paths. I mean, there's not very many really structured paths in agriculture. I mean, even if you go get a PhD, in a lot of industries, if you go get a PhD, you're pretty pigeonholed, and you better be sure that that's what you want to do because, there's not a lot of, opportunity to kind of get out and, do something different. But in agriculture, I think even in that, path, there's just a lot of flexibility. And so I think it's a great, asset for agriculture in general is, you can get in there and kind of see what you like and what you don't like and maybe go do something a little bit different. And you just hear lots of stories in agriculture of people. Yeah, I got into sales and I didn't really like that. And so I ended up doing research or whatever it is. There's just a lot of flexibility there that doesn't necessarily exist in other industries.
Yes. And I think about fellow PhDs that study nutrition, and some of them, I've got one in human. It's in your part of the world that works for Lonza. It's human side. I think about one of the younger PhDs from K-State. He's in animal behavior, working with Gestalt on sow feeding. He's not doing nutrition. I think there's a lot of illustrations outside of animal nutrition where having a PhD doesn't encumber you like it would in other industries. Like if you get a PhD in electrical engineering, you're either going to teach or you're going to teach, or maybe you'll teach.
Yeah, I always tell people about that. I think it's one of the things that we don't do a good enough job of advertising. I think in agriculture, in attracting people is just that flexibility. And, I worked for Cargill for 15 years. Man, there's 1,000 career paths in Cargill, and so a lot of that's just about, getting involved and, seeing what's out there. So, I was fortunate enough that I knew pretty early on generally what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in agriculture. I wanted to work in animal agriculture, and I was almost 100% sure about that. But yeah, I mean, my career path is certainly an example. I never would have predicted almost any of the turns really, other than just, that broad, goal of wanting to work in animal agriculture. I never would have imagined where I ended up landing.
Well, you took that 360-degree agricultural pie and just cut it to 180.
Yeah.
So it's still a big piece of pie you had an option to get into.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, as we talked about earlier, our paths from a career standpoint, our timelines are 1 year off, and we covered what some people would say is possibly the biggest debacle in the swine industry of the price drop in 1998. I remember being at the Hy-Vee in Ankeny, Iowa. That August or September. And I had just talked to a customer that gave away a semi-load of pigs because he had nobody else that took it. He just gave it away. He even paid to truck it. And I was at the meat counter, and Iowa chops are selling for like $5.99 a pound or some crazy price. And it got to me, and I had the gumption to go to the meat manager going, hey, here's the disparity between people not far from this grocery store losing their butts, and you're making pretty good freaking money on this 1.5-inch thick pork chop. And in retrospect, we can come up with a lot of theories on what happened, and we can describe it. Hey, we didn't have enough shackle space. But as I was preparing for our time together, I thought back to some PhD work I was doing with a group in Minnesota, and they shared their closeouts on a 1,000-head barn. And I think the profit per pig, so this was 96 or 97, probably 96, they were making $35 a pig. And it was ungodly. And I'll remember that's $1996, not $2025. So that could be close to a $100 bill if we put it in today's. So I think there was a setup where people on the outside were looking in like, man, there's a lot of money. And in fact, the barns that I was doing PhD work on, only half of them were owned by farmers. The others were some sort of consortium. But I think that set us up for what we saw starting in 99, 2000, 2001, and maybe the premium standard might be the poster child for influx of outside money. So can you kind of give us your consultant view of what happened in that 99 to 2010 and how outside money, as we like to call it Wall Street money, might have affected consolidation and set us up for where we are in 2025?
Yeah, I think the industry really, and one of the charts that I like to use when I'm describing the sort of the history of the U.S. industry. A lot of times when I go to international clients, and a lot of times they want me to give a presentation on, what are things like in the U.S. And I always try to encourage them to go ahead and let me spend a little bit of time giving you a little bit of history here so you can understand where we're going, especially in China, because I think, I always tell them you're gonna see a similar process. Everything tends to happen faster in China, right? But there's sort of a natural evolution that I think most industries tend to go through. And so it's really instructive. But one of the charts that I use in that discussion, and actually, to be honest with you, I could probably give the whole presentation using that one chart. And it shows the sow inventory in the U.S. I think it starts in 1980. Sow inventory in the U.S. and then metric tons of pork production per year. And what you see up into the, early to mid 90s is they basically track together, right? As sow inventory goes up, pork production goes up, and as sow inventory goes down, pork production goes down. And then there's something really obvious that happens to any, observer in that chart, because what happens is in the 90s, the sow inventory first kind of stabilizes and then eventually starts to decline. And the pork production in metric tons or in kilograms or in pounds or however you want to look at it just explodes. And so, you look at that and you think, okay, well, something major happened here.
That would take somebody even outside of ag to go,
what the heck happened in the 90s,
Yeah.
And so, and I work to try to explain, a lot of those, factors that came into play there, but it was really, if you want to talk about it at the macro level, it was the professionalization of the industry, right? So we got specialized. We went to multi-site production, which allowed us to specialize, do all in, all out. There was some technological developments around that time that kind of allowed us to implement some genetic knowledge we already knew. Obviously, nutrition changed a lot in that decade, just in terms of our, phase feeding and, all kinds of, different things changed. But really at the end of the day, it was just the professionalization of the industry. And, there was a lot of, inside money that built that transition. But then, at the end of that kind of heavy investment, there was, that year that was so painful for everybody. And that triggered a lot of losses. And then, and we saw some, outside money come in after that. And so I think from a technical perspective, in the early part of the, basically in the 90s, we saw this, technical professionalization of the industry. And then in the early 2000s, you started to see, kind of the business side of it start to professionalize more. And that led, not necessarily, but usually leads to consolidation. So you had losses and then sort of professionalization of the management of the business of swine production. And really, some would argue that maybe changed the industry more than the technical piece. But that's sort of stabilized, I think, in the last few years. And I had an interesting conversation with someone the other day, that said, okay, the assumption has sort of been that we're going to end up with a poultry model, right? That the pork is going to end up basically where poultry's at. And I'm not sure that that's going to happen. I think that's still an open question. We've kind of gotten close to that, but we haven't really taken those next steps. And I think there's some biological reasons for that. I think there's some timing reasons for that. But it'll be really interesting to see where we go from here, because I don't think that's at all clear. Is there going to be continued consolidation? I'm sure there will be. But it's never, I don't think, going to be at the pace that it was in the, early to mid, 2000 to 2015 or 2016. There was a lot that happened there. I don't think we're ever going to probably see that again. Let's just say one of the top 10 producers just came up for sale today. One of the big questions is who's going to buy it, right? Like how does that even happen? So, it was a really interesting time there that you and I experienced directly in kind of the aftermath of 98 and some of that outside money coming in. But that hasn't happened in a while. And a lot of those buildings that were built during that time period are still in operation, and a lot of them are not in great shape. I was in a facility last year in Kentucky, and I told my client, I'm not going to consult in this building next year. We got to do something different, man. It's literally falling down, and so there's a lot of those buildings out there. I did an informal survey at World Pork a few years ago, just to ask people what percentage of the sow farms that are in operation today were built in the 90s. And it's a big chunk, and those aren't going to last forever, right? We've done a good job of stretching out those facilities, but the problem is new money can't really come into the industry right now. There's not a sufficient, situation for new money to come into the industry. And I think that's a problem. I think, long-term sustainability, we've got to resolve that.
Well, I had a conversation with somebody that works for quasi-integrator in the Eastern Corn Belt that is across multiple species, and he said that they had not made money on their pig operation for 5 or 6 years, that the other species were subsidizing it, and they were trying to attribute some economies of scale from a milling standpoint and corn turnover to justify keeping their pigs. But if you've got a quasi-integrator that hasn't made money in 5 years, that's not attractive for somebody from Silicon Valley or Wall Street to go, hey, I'm going to throw lots of zeros at this industry, right?
Well, and the way I've kind of tried to, construct the argument is there's really 3 characteristics of the industry now that I think are not compatible with long-term sustainability, economic sustainability. And that is we have a high capital requirements, both in working capital, maybe especially in working capital, to get into the business. If you want to get into the business, either buy your way in or build your way into the industry right now, it's hard for me to even imagine, somebody saying, hey, I want to build, it happens all the time in China, I'm thinking about building a system to produce, 2 million pigs or whatever, but that's almost unthinkable here. I can't even imagine if somebody said that, I would just assume they were crazy. And so that's, whether you're going to buy your way in or build your way in, the capital requirements are significant. The margins are tight, seem to be getting tighter all the time. And then that last factor is volatility, right? And to me, you have to address at least one of those 3, sufficiently in order to attract investor money. into the industry. And if you can't attract investor money into the industry, then I don't think you have fundamental sustainability. Probably we're going to have a hard time addressing the capital requirements. That, if anything, that's probably going to get worse. But the other two, I think we have an opportunity to address. And really so many of the challenges that we run into as an industry, I think can be explained at least partially by these small margins, right? Like, there's just not enough money in the industry. There's not enough profit in the industry to kind of drive the, growth and innovation and all that kind of stuff that we really need to kind of make this shift. So I really feel like it's an industry and kind of at a crossroads, and the future is not at all certain.
No.
And I think it'll be a really interesting decade, I think, coming to see where this goes.
If we look at those buildings that you talked about that were built in the 2000, 2005 range and compare that with somebody that wants to sign a contract with whoever in 2025, that contract's going to have the same absolute dollars per pig space. And the costs are dramatically different, and the value of that dollar is completely different than it was 25 years ago. So that's just an illustration of, hey, there's no money. I'm going to pay you $40. It's the same $40 you got in 2005. I think the other thing that shows that we're really tight on margins is think back to those illustrations that you were doing at Cargill Pork, encouraging people to put up buildings. It was, we're going to pay you this much. The building cost is going to be this. You're going to pay for it in 5 years or 7 years. And oh, by the way, look at all this manure you're going to get for free. Those illustrations now, that value of that manure comes back into the value of that building. So it makes that $40 you're getting look profitable, but you've got this big old trunk over here of fertilizer that plays into it. So that changes the perspective of the industry to get outside players or even inside players to put new buildings up.
Yep. Well, and you think about, okay, well, those three characteristics have to some degree been mostly true for, several years now. And so then you think about, okay, well then how have we kind of dealt with it up until this point? And one of the ways we've dealt with it is stretching out the useful life of these facilities. That's definitely one of them. I mean, clearly that has an expiration date. Do we know for sure what that is? Probably. I don't know how long we can deal with the facilities, some of these older facilities that we have. It's probably longer than I think, though. That's been my experience. So that's one of the ways we've done it. Consolidation is another way we've done it. Again, consolidation gets harder and harder the more consolidated you get, taking that next step. And so if that's going to be part of the solution moving forward, it's going to be less of a part of the solution than it has been in the past. And then another way we've done that is through contract production. We've gotten around that capital requirement that would have been really, pretty impossible for an integrator, to kind of rationalize locking up that amount of capital to do the wean to finish for these systems. And so, we've done most of that growth through contract production, which I'm a big believer in contract production. I think it's been great for the industry as a whole. I think it's been great for the agriculture community, for younger farmers having a way to get into the industry. There's just a lot of great things that have come about. But the deal that was made there, like you alluded to, was, this is not, a hugely profitable venture, but it's really safe. And in agriculture, steady money is, even if it's a small amount of your overall income, is always always definitely a nice thing and pretty rare. So that's definitely part of it. But the big motivator for a lot of these guys was the manure. And as the manure becomes a bigger and bigger part of the value, what we've seen is not necessarily intentionally, but a disconnect between the pig owners and the people that are taking advantage of that manure. So, the pig owners are probably capturing less than 20% of that manure value. And it just seems like it keeps getting bigger and bigger. So that becomes one of those deals is, wow, are we going to be able to continue to give away that kind of value, in that contract production relationship? What does that need to look like moving forward? So I think what's clear to me is the way we got here is not the way we're going to get there. Right. And so we're going to have to do, something pretty substantially differently, I think, in order to continue to grow this industry. And I'm a little disappointed that the industry doesn't seem to be quite ready to grapple with some of those big questions. And I think, the sooner you start to deal with those issues and try to resolve some of these challenges, the easier it is to deal with, and the less painful the transition is. And the longer you wait, the more painful. And so I'm concerned for my industry that our unwillingness to engage in a discussion about what does this need to look like moving forward is going to make that transition more painful.
Well, I had two experiences that play right in with what you talked about. One was a producer that raised 40,000 pigs that they bought, and they wanted to take the phytase out because they wanted to make their manure more valuable. They raised the pigs, they own the pigs, they own the manure. So the illustration of, hey, you're really going to hurt your pigs, it's not going to pay off, we can do some things, that was an easy illustration. But if you're just got a quad barn, you get the manure out of it, that argument to go back to, hey, take that phytase out because it makes my manure and it makes my profitability based upon the matrices that you use better. But the guy sitting in West Branch, setting the dais, goes, man, you're making a whole crap load of money using phytase. Makes economic sense from raising that pig. So that disconnect is going to be huge. I had a customer in Northeast Iowa. His sons chose to get back in the operation. They invested in a 12,000 head sow unit in South Dakota. And it just 12,000 head. I had 12 sows and thought that was a lot of work. 12,000. But from some logistics, they got a full barn's worth of pigs in one truckload, and they were the same age. So they got put in a barn. It was easy to manage, but that's kind of an incremental improvement. They went from 2 or 3 loads of pigs to 1. So we're making those small improvements. But where are we going to get rid of 12,000 sows worth of 24 genetic? I mean, that should be getting rid of 15,000 sows someplace else, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so those are some of those incremental changes that we have to approach. And I think what you talked about with your 3 characteristics are really big. I had another customer in Northeast Iowa, consortium of family members. Once a pig hits the barn, they hedge the corn and they hedge the pig. And if they made $5 a pig, they were happy. If they lost $3 a pig, they were happy. But they locked in 2 of those 3 that you talked about and were happy with it. Now, how many people that are 25 years old would go out and say, hey, I'm going to do all this work for $5 a pig?
Yeah. It really is. And I think, obviously, one of the solutions to the volatility and potentially the margin issue is around risk management. I think we've made a lot of progress there. There's a lot more tools available today than there was even just a few years ago. But I think there's still plenty of opportunity there to develop new tools and expand the use of the tools that we do have available. That's definitely a piece of the calculation. One of the things that I've just, as a thought exercise with some of my clients, I've just challenged them to think about a scenario where at some point in the future, less than 50% of their revenue comes from meat. Comes from those pigs that are going to market for meat. As you start thinking about the future and being able to take advantage of some of the opportunities in this, green transition or whatever, whether that's the manure value or the energy value, potential energy value there, whether that's wind or solar or gas off of the manure, or there's a lot of different directions that could go. I think there's a scenario there where that's, it sounds a little bit crazy now, but it's really not. And I think that's probably where we're headed. And so if we start thinking about this a little bit differently, where, it's not just pounds of pork out the door, that's the way we make our money, your motivations all start to change. I'll give you an example. I was working a few years ago with a group that was wanting to sell carbon credits by covering lagoons and capturing the gas. And one of the challenges that we had is we didn't have enough pigs in one location. And they were limited in that scenario. They had to be close to an existing pipeline because you had to sell the carbon credits in California. And so you didn't have to prove that the gas went to California, but you had to prove that the gas could have gone to California. And so you couldn't just capture it and use it there. You had to get it in, you had to scrub it, and you had to get it into the pipeline. And so we start looking at, potential locations, and there's just not that many of them, right? That have enough pigs in one location that's close enough, that's also close enough to a pipeline for that to make sense. And that was really, it's not the direction that the industry is going naturally, right? In fact, we would say we don't really want that many pigs in one location, just from a health perspective. The risk is too high. But, if at some point in the future, that becomes a significant enough portion of your revenue, maybe you decide just to take the risk on the health side because the opportunity is really big over here. So, that's a real fundamental shift in, sort of the motivation of how you're planning on growing your business. And so those are the kind of things I'm talking about. I don't know if that's where, this ends up, but there's enough money potentially there that could influence those types of decisions where you've got to take these other variables into consideration that you've never even considered before.
But doesn't that impetus have to come from the private sector? And I think a recent illustration of why that needs to happen is look at the funding that Congress just approved. Was it $10 billion direct payments and $20 billion in emergency? And how much of that is going to go to livestock producers outside of disaster payments? Zero, right?
Mm-hmm.
The magnitude of money that would be involved to push that change can't come from the government, at least from a swine standpoint. Is that right?
I would say it's unlikely that it does. It could, but I would say that's unlikely. I wouldn't advise the industry to count on it. That's for sure. So yeah, it is going to have to be, economically viable. Just look at that example that I gave you. That was a real frustration. We couldn't really figure out a way to make that work within the constraints. But if we could have, captured that gas and generated electricity on site, used it, and been able to capture that carbon credit, then it starts making a lot more sense in a lot more places, right? So you'd have to have a market there that, that made that possible. How likely is that? I don't know, but that's not, certainly not outside the realm of possibilities.
If you think that we put a digester in, we turn that into methane, then we turn that methane into fuel for generators, and then the excess goes to the grid, there's a lot of steps, there's a lot of integration there that isn't as simple as just throwing a cover crop on and getting $100 an acre.
Yeah. There's a lot of moving parts there. You're talking about a pretty significant capital investment that is going to be dependent on political whims
yes.
to some degree, at least for a period of time. And so that's a real challenge. I'm certainly not downplaying that at all. But there's going to be a lot of money thrown at this, I think from the private sector and government money thrown at this. So, I'm encouraging, my clients to begin doing some scenario planning and thinking through some potential scenarios there on the longer term horizon and starting to think about what that would mean for their business. Because I think it's going to get really interesting in the next few years.
This is the end of part 1 of my conversation with Todd Thurman. Join us in parts 2 and 3 that were uploaded at the same time as this episode, where we continue our conversation into consolidation and other timely topics of the pork industry. Todd will continue sharing his journey from the dusty plains of the Texas Panhandle to Texas Tech University and to how he is helping pork farms throughout the world improve profitability and sustainability.